Hello, everyone. I am Nikunj Bajaj, and welcome again to our next episode of True ML Talks. Today, it's a super exciting episode. We have Jerry Liu, who is the creator and co founder of one of our favorite tools in the LLM stack, which is LlamaIndex. And I'm super excited to talk about this. This is going to be more of a technical discussion than we have had in the past. So, a lot of you might really enjoy all the developments, the most exciting developments that are happening in the LLM space. With this, Jerry, welcome, and would love to have you introduce yourself a bit in your own words.
Sounds great. Thanks, Nikunj, for having me on this podcast, and I'm super excited to be here. So, just to give a quick introduction, my name is Jerry. I'm the co-founder slash creator of LlamaIndex, which is a popular open source tool to connect your language models with your private data sources. I've started working on this project around 6 months ago. I can talk a little bit about the journey to get to where we are today as well. But since the origins, the project has grown significantly. It's has a tremendous community, a lot of users, both in the individual setting as well as the enterprise setting. And so it's just a super exciting time to be in generative AI. And one of our goals is just to enable the developer to build amazing application experiences using LLMs on top of your own data. And so I think, but before this, I spent some time in both ML research as well as engineering. And spent some time as an AI research scientist at Uber, as a machine learning engineering manager at Robust Intelligence, spent some time as an ML engineer at Quora as well. But here we are.
Awesome. And Jerry, was your time at Uber and Quora and Robust Intelligence dealing with a lot of text data and LLMs itself? Tell us a little bit about what got you to working on LlamaIndex, I assume.
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. I think throughout my career, I've kind of covered a broad swath of different areas of ML. And I do think that my experience and kind of like having a bit of experience in diving into all these different aspects has helped me get a holistic understanding of the space, which I am appreciative of. I will say, for instance, at Quora, I was working on recommendation systems for our homepage feed, which honestly, like you were working a lot with embeddings, like text features, collaborative filtering techniques. A lot of that stuff is pretty related to information retrieval, which is not a new field, but these days is being used with LLMs to create these cool like retrieval augmented generation systems. At Uber, I spent a lot of time doing kind of like deeper AI research in a more academic setting. And that was more on like computer vision and unstructured data, but a lot of the concepts carry over to NLP as well, right? And I think for a lot of my research journey, I've been very interested in this idea of generative models. In fact, just a fun fact, like one of the first things that got me into deep learning, machine learning in the first place was after I discovered like GANs. And so, GANs are like 6 years old, at this point, like 6, 7 years old. And I remember looking at the paper and I saw that, this AI model could start generating images of like chairs, like bedrooms, like all these like different, like very small icon images. And I thought it was amazing. It blew my mind, right? And so I've been following the progress of generative AI these past few years. It's been amazing. And I think, LlamaIndex itself, it did start somewhat recently. I started this about like 6 months ago. I've always roughly kept tabs on the development of like transformers and like, the GPT like models, as well as like language model developments like BERT and all these other things. But I think I started seriously playing around with it about 6 months ago. And you could say I like drew upon my experiences and trying to like build this into a useful tool. But at the same time, it was at the time, a lot of people were getting into this space, and a lot of this did kind of come spontaneously.
So yeah, thanks a lot, Jerry, for sharing that background. One question, like you talked about 6 months ago, you started playing a lot with LLMs and generative AI, like more closely, right? What in those experiments kind of triggered the thought that you want to build some tooling in this space, working with your own data sets with respect to LLMs, etc. Would love to hear, how did this start?
Yeah, it's a good question. These days, LlamaIndex is a very comprehensive toolkit around your data. When it first started, it was really around this idea of how do you basically augment a language model, which is inherently stateless, with state that the language model doesn't really know about, right? Because the language model with GPT-3 was something that takes in an input and gives you an output. And it has some like hash space in the input prompt. And you could use that cache space to feed it some new data and have it reason over that data. But what I was really interested in it is how do you like build a system around this? If you treat the language model as like a processor, similar to like a computer analogy, and then you have some other modules that maybe provide the RAM or storage. How do you build this like overall system? How do you get the CPU to like store external data somewhere, and then it can like traverse this data later? And that was very much what motivated the initial design of like GPT index, which was like a tree-based structure where you could like organize information in like a tree and then have the LLM like traverse that tree, as well. And so I was just like very interested in kind of like exploring this problem as a design project. And then I think it clearly resonated with some people in the community that were thinking about similar things of how do you actually feed external data into language models. And then I think at a certain point, as I was working on this for about a month or so, I realized there's probably like a real opportunity here. Like it's quite interesting. There's like things that I could do here that would actually, provide some tools and make it really easy for other users to just like build applications on top of their own data. And so then, I kind of made a decision to pivot LlamaIndex into something that was more of a practical toolkit to solve this like overall mission of just you have all this like private data in your system. It's unstructured, structured. How do you best like figure out ways to feed this data into the language model, right? Through some sort of like, retrieval mechanism. What's the best way to do that? And I think it really like took this initial idea of how do you augment language models with some state into this like more comprehensive toolkit.
Awesome, great. And fast forward to today, like 6 months down the line, of course, LlamaIndex is such a popular tool today. The three most loved features by the users about the project, yeah.
Yeah, so LlamaIndex itself kind of consists of like a few core components. And, like within each of these components, like a lot of users are kind of like using it for different things. I would say probably like the first component is just like data ingestion. And so how do you load data from different data sources into just like unstructured text into this format that you can then easily pass to the language model? So we've created this site a few months ago called Llama Hub, which is just a community-driven site of data loaders, just to load data, from any sort of file formats like PDFs, PowerPoints, like Excel sheets, like documents, to APIs, like if you have a Salesforce or Notion or like a Slack, to any sort of data that's stored in your database. And we just encourage the community to contribute like all these different types of data loaders. And so, there's a lot of people working on amazing tools and like text parsing and document parsing. And we just wanted people to be able to leverage those technologies and use it with LLMs. So I would say like a lot of people are using our document loaders or just like data loaders in general. And that's on Llama Hub. The other part is probably through just like the very, the nature of like the API, like the indexing API. Once you actually have this data, you want to build some indexes on top of this data. And then probably like one of the things that a lot of people do like about LlamaIndex is the fact that it's actually super easy to get set up and running, right? Like I think the fact that you can basically load data, index data, and query data in about 3 to 4 lines of code when you first get started is actually something that a lot of users do find very powerful and actually does appeal to quite a lot of users that might not have like super deep technical experience, and all of a sudden they're able to like unlock all this value over their data. So that part I think is something that people do really like. And then the next part I would say is there's like the audience that really likes the ease of use aspect, and then there's an audience that also really enjoys the kind of more advanced like retrieval capabilities. And so we've put out a lot of more advanced functionality to solve like a lot of different types of use cases for LlamaIndex. This includes like asking like different types of questions, not just like simple questions, but also stuff that requires you to like compare different documents against each other, to be able to like do multi-step reasoning, to be able to like route to different sources. And there's like a segment of users that do really like our features in that direction.
Awesome. I particularly like when I first came across LlamaIndex, I wanted to build out like a simple Q&A system on something like a Confluence or Notion type of a thing, and I came across like the Llama Hub, saw a bunch of data connectors. It's actually very very intuitive to build out some sort of query on these through these integrations. So yeah.
It's awesome.
Like before joining the call, Jerry, I was
Mhm.
looking into some of the stuff that you have been talking about lately, and I noticed one of the things that you tested out recently is the Anthropic
Mhm.
100K window model, right? Tell us a little bit about that experience. Like, what did you like? What did you feel there was missing? What's happening? Yeah.
Yeah, I could talk at length about this, but in general, I'm like super excited about this type of technology. I do think the idea of like having a really long context window doesn't necessarily like obviate or remove like what we're doing. In fact, I think they can definitely complement each other in interesting ways. But like just a brief bit of background, like Anthropic released some update like last week a week and a half ago, where basically they said, hey, the input length for Claude, you can now put like 100,000 tokens in there, right? And like the longest so far was probably GPT-4 at 32,000 tokens. And then before that, like GPT-3 obviously had like 4,000 tokens. And so, yeah, 100,000 tokens, quite a lot. It can fit basically around like 100 pages of text, I would say. And it's like a decent amount that you could fit in. So I was very interested in this, and I thought to myself, oh, like what can you actually do with this 100,000 token window? And one of the examples that they showed on the press release was being able to run over like an SEC 10K filing. So what I did was I took Uber's SEC 10K for like 2021 and then try to feed that into the token window. And what's interesting is that like the Uber SEC filing is actually still too long for the 100,000 tokens. The Uber SEC filing is around like 160,000 tokens, which is exceeds this context window. So you actually can't dump the entire thing into the window even if you tried. But the goal of the experiment was just like basically the advantage of having such a long context window is that you don't need to do or at least the idea that I wanted to test is that like don't need to do as much like kind of fancy retrieval from your data source and like really be selective about what you put into the prompt because the prompt window is so big. Let's just try like dumping everything in there. And
Right.
so what I tried was I just tried dumping this entire SEC document into the prompt with some like very basic iteration strategy because the context was still a little bit larger than what the prompt window allowed. And what I found was like first, there are a few components that were very interesting. One is the 100,000 token API is actually pretty fast. It's faster than if you query like GPT-3's API repeatedly. Like for instance, if you break 100,000 tokens into like 25 chunks, each like 4,000 tokens, and that actually fits within like the GPT-3 context window. And then you make 25 calls to the GPT-3 API, each with 4,000 tokens. That's going to take longer than if you just like put everything into the 100,000 token window. So, they don't release details on what the implementation is, but it's actually quite interesting. I'd be curious to see like, what what the algorithm is to allow these speedups. The next part is the nice thing about having a big context window is that it does give the language model a bit more of like holistic understanding over the entire data. So if there's like distant relationships between like the beginning and end of like this giant piece of text you feed it, it is able to synthesize that to a reasonable degree. And I think that's very interesting. There are parts though that still require tuning. It still tends to like not obey like more complicated instructions and tends to like be a little bit confused as to like it doesn't quite have a sense of what to do. That's something I've noticed that like GPT-4 I think is a little bit better at. And then the other part is, there are certain types of questions where like it just doesn't like you're putting like you're stuffing the 100K window and it's just very costly to do so. And so like yes you can in a lot of cases, but there's a question of like should you, right? And like especially if you think about the cost, like it ends up being about $1 or $2 for every query if you fill up the entire token window. And for a lot of settings that maybe require a high volume of queries, this might not make sense. So a lot of interesting insights there, but this is something that we're curious about, like continuing to explore.
That's very on point, Jerry. Like I actually this cost aspect is one of the things that I hear a lot about when I talk to folks working with LLMs, and like sometimes I actually find it impractical that you keep sending like these really long context windows because you keep getting charged by the token number, right? It's just It can really blow up your cost that way. Now, I think you also, you mentioned about this a little bit, that is the create and refine response synthesis, right? Like basically, how do you do this with respect to the cloud model, right? Like, would love to go a little bit deeper into that. That what were some of the challenges that you faced, and how do you think that the tree summarization approach that we're talking about can be used as a good alternative here?
Yeah. So definitely happy to talk about this, and maybe just taking a step back for like listeners, um, like we have this overall idea of this response synthesis module, and the idea is to really abstract away the complexity of feeding in context that might exceed the prompt window. So if you have, a question over a bunch of context, and this context exceeds whatever the prompt window is, you still want to be able to have a way to have the LLM understand all this context. And so we have developed like a few kind of different types of response synthesis strategies. One is called create and refine. The other is like tree summarization. And both are just strategies of how do you like take a large amount of context and, break it up in a way that you can still ask a question over all this context. So for create and refine, the way it works is let's say you have like the Uber SEC document, right? And so like what it doesn't, that entire thing doesn't actually fit in the 100,000 token window. So what you do is you first break it up into two chunks, maybe like 90,000 tokens each, and then feed the first chunk into an input prompt, and you say something like, here's some context, and you dump the 80,000 token 90,000 token context in there, and then given this context, please answer the following question, and you give it the question, and you send the entire thing right into the language model, and then you get a response out of it. Now then you take that response, and then then you feed it through what we call like a refine prompt. You take that initial response, and then the new prompt says something like, here's the existing answer, here's some more context, here's the question. Given this new context, please refine the existing answer, right, with this context to try to better answer the question. And then you feed this back into the language model, and you get back a response. So this is just like a way of iteratively calling the LLM on new context, like sequentially, so that you can synthesize an answer over all the context. We tried this with Anthropic's model, and then what we found is that at least for the refined prompt, it tends to get a little confused because the refined prompt is a little bit complicated. If you think about it, there's like three pieces in there. Here's some existing answer. Here's some more context. Here's the question. Please refine the answer. It's kind of like, it does take a little bit of mental energy to understand. And the model tends to not do amazing on that type of reasoning. What we have found that works a little bit better in terms of response synthesis is this other approach that we described, which is like tree summarization, where let's say you have like n chunks of context. You can first get an answer for each chunk of context independently, because each chunk will fit into the prompt. So first synthesize an answer over each chunk, and then hierarchically combine these answers almost in like a tree structure until you get to one root node. And then that root node is your final answer given the question. We did find that when you use that type of strategy, it just tends to work a little bit better. But as to why that's the case, like maybe it's just like the prompt is a little bit simpler, but who knows?
Got it. I see. One thing here, Jerry, if you think about passing the context in, in, I guess, installments, right? Like in a loop or
Mhm.
something. There is a chance that the model can miss out, can basically start performing a little bit worse on the recall, because like it may miss the thing that comes in a continuation. Now, for a really large context window, it probably the impact dies down. But like, have you actually seen any practical challenges with respect to like this iteratively passing the context to the model?
Yeah, I think there's definitely, I mean, like the response synthesis strategies are more kind of like a hack anyways, because in the end you lose information, and the key question is just how do you like compress information so that you still like fit within the prompt window. So for create and refine, one thing we've noticed is that the model tends to just like accumulate details over time, and so whether or not the context is actually relevant, like the answer just gets longer the further down you go down the chain. That's just an interesting property that you notice. With tree summarization, one con is just like because you're kind of like hierarchically summarizing at every level of the tree, it tends to start losing out on like finer level details.
Hmm. I see. Awesome. Thanks. Thank you so much for sharing this. Now, in terms of working with your own data, obviously like one approach which seems like is the more common approach today is like the retrieval and then the Q&A type of system, right? Like similar to what LlamaIndex also focuses on quite a bit, right? That you
Mhm.
take the chunks of the basically query index, take chunks out of the document, and then give that as a context to the large language model, right?
Yeah.
The other thing that you could potentially do is go the fine tuning route, right? Have you like actually compared the performance of the two? In which case would you recommend people using the retrieval? In which case would you recommend people using the fine tuning route?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. It's something that, I think I've kind of like flip-flopped on as like, there's advances in both of these. Um, by the way, like I think Llama Index, for what it's worth, has started almost like it's basically exclusively in the retrieval augmented generation camp right now. But that's more of just a function of the fact that for a variety of reasons, it's a lot easier to use, easier to get started for people. People don't need to think about training the model. They just need to think about how to use this model that's pre-trained and just use it on top of their data and create a data pipeline basically between the data and the model. So there are advantages to this idea of like retrieval augmented generation. Um, Fine tuning, I think, I'm honestly actually very excited by. I think like if you just think about like the reason these models are so good is because they've been trained on massive amounts of data. And if you
Right.
just ask it any amount of any question that requires it to kind of synthesize stuff from its own internal like knowledge corpus, like its weights, it can actually do a lot of very interesting things. Like all the stuff that you see with LLMs, it can like do style transfer, it can like generate like poetry and synthesize new information, right? And or just like act as a Wikipedia and you can look up stuff within the weights. So honestly, I think fine tuning is very powerful. I just don't think so far these bigger companies that these model for these model providers have provided amazing UXs that actually make sense for the end user. Because a lot of fine tuning APIs, like if you look at OpenAI's API, it's like super expensive. It's like under maintained, and actually the marginal cost per token goes up if you actually do a fine tune model.
Right.
And so it's just impractical for most users. That said, I think there's a lot of like more recent advancements these days of like both smaller open source models as well as like kind of like more accessible ways of like fine tuning on top of your data, right? And I think a recent example of this is like Laura, which is like low rank kind of like matrix factorization for like updating the weights and just makes it way easier to train your own models. So I've been kind of like following these developments, and I think there could be a world where fine tuning itself actually offers like better cost benefit trade offs than if you try to like feed everything into a retrieval augmented system. I will say though, I do think like the future will probably be some mix of both, because um, like the idea is that like you will probably want some sort of model that's like a continual learner, but you'll also want that model to be able to reference some external source of information if it doesn't inherently know that knowledge. And I think like it just makes sense to probably combine the two, right? And I think that that's a future that I could totally see happening.
Got it. What do you mean by combining the two per se? Like, could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Yeah, I would love to. Like, of course, like the point that you make about how the RAG system can actually get you the source of the data a lot more easily, which is always useful as an end user. But like, what would a combination look like?
One example of this is, let's say a model, you ask this model a question. The model can either kind of like surface an answer if it already knows the answer, or say that it doesn't know the answer. And then if it doesn't know the answer, it has the reasoning capabilities to, perform actions in the world to look up the answer for itself, right? And so like, if we right now, if you treat LlamaIndex as one of these tools that it could use, it could call LlamaIndex as like a management layer over their data in order to retrieve back the right information about their data, if it doesn't actually know it itself, right? But at the same time, like you could use some of the powers of fine tuning and model training by actually being able to like have this model continuously learn on your internal corpus of data, and so actually it gets better at like both reasoning over the knowledge over your data as well as like over the structure of your data. And when it gets better at reasoning over the structure, it can figure out how to like better, look up and retrieve information later on. So for
Got it.
instance, like one instantiation of this is like if you just like fine tune a model to be really, really good at retrieval, all right? and then but still have like the knowledge be baked in, or sorry, have the knowledge be stored in some like external knowledge base. And so then like you still leverage some of the advantages of the fine tuning so that it just gets very, very good at being able to search for stuff, but the actual like data itself is maybe stored externally. And so you still need this retrieval augmented system.
Makes sense. Makes a ton of sense. Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jerry. You touched on a very important point, by the way, while you were answering this question around like how like the some of the commercial LLM vendors like OpenAI right now the
Yep.
cost it could be cost prohibitive to fine tune a model. But then there's also this another side of open source models like smaller that are much more amenable to fine tuning, right? Uh,
Mhm.
of course, people have to know a bit more. So I think it requires a bit more technical depth to be able to fine tune, but at least like from a compute and cost perspective, I think they're much cheaper, right? So would love to understand from you, how do you think this world of fine tuning evolving with respect to the entire the commercial vendors compared to the open source space? It's again a question that we get a lot from our community.
Yeah, I honestly I feel like this is one of those questions that pretty much everybody in the community is figuring out, and honestly, probably including like OpenAI and Anthropic and all these other model providers. Because yeah, like I mean, if you're talking about the Google article, like yeah, there's been a ton of advancements in the open source LLMs these past few weeks, and so like and a lot of it is both on like reduction of the model size as well as like a greater accessibility to fine tuning. And so now, I think there is like instances where you can start like fine tuning a model on your laptop, right? And so then like the cost equation just gets like way nicer because now you don't need like these complex machines or spend like hundreds of dollars to like fine tune over some new source of data. So I think like it's just in general, I think I like there's basically been a trend these past few weeks where open source models are starting to become like a bit more popular, like people for a variety of reasons, right? It's like the fact that one, like people don't like the idea of monopolies. Two is people like the idea of like privacy, and so just like for enterprise use, like open source models tend to be a bit more appealing because you don't like send stuff to a third party API. And then three is probably some aspect of like cost. And so I can see a future where like open source models do become like a predominant paradigm. But I do think one thing I can say with like a much higher certainty is the fact that like I think a few months ago people were kind of thinking OpenAI was just going to like monopolize everything, but I really don't think that's the case right now. I think with a lot of the ecosystem of models, there's just like a ton of incentives for everybody from like the academic community to the industry to like to like the hobbyists to just like create an entire ecosystem like different types of models that you can use.
For sure, absolutely. Um, So, in terms of, do you plan to include a lot of this like as you mentioned right now, Llama Index is almost exclusively focused on the retrieval augmented generation, right? Like, do you plan to include a bunch of fine tuning in the do you have that on the roadmap, or that's a little bit far out?
I think it it's a good question. Um, I'm not sure how much details I can share, but like I think it's more also just like a matter of like how it fits within our vision. And so maybe just like taking a step back, like what is our vision? Our vision is to just like unlock the capabilities of like all the things you can do with language models over your own private data, right? And create like, the management and query layer for your data. And so right now that means primarily how do you structure your data for a retrieval augmented generation purpose. You could imagine some hypothetical world where you also structure your data to be amenable to fine tuning, and then you can like have some way of like trading off between whether you want to fine tune your model or use it with like retrieval augmented frameworks. um, I wouldn't say that answer is like super concrete yet, but I think certainly a possibility.
Got it. Understood. Sounds good. In terms of prompt engineering, we see that there's a lot of startups trying to solve this problem, right? How do you track your prompts? How do you track the responses? How do you evaluate the models, and not just the prompts themselves, but also the response from different versions of the models and stuff like that, right? So the if you think about the general problem of the LLM evaluations, right? What are some of the trends that you're seeing? What do you think some of the most promising ways in which people are running evaluations and figuring out, okay, what's the best thing that I can do today?
Yeah, I think there's a few components here. I think one is what's the best UX for experimenting with prompts, and then the second is how do you best do evaluation of like the predicted outputs. I would say I think prompt engineering is something that's kind of interesting because it's basically just like you're manually tuning the words right in the input to try to see like what would produce the best output. And it's actually not that different than some form of like hyperparameter selection for machine learning, right? Like if you're I don't know, if you're like a traditional ML practitioner, you probably like do some grid search over a bunch of like hyperparameters. You probably like change the model itself, right? And then the whole idea is if you look at the language model as a function, this function takes in x, which is like an input, as well as like theta, which is like the parameters of the model. And so, like in addition to changing the parameters of the model with prompt engineering, you're really just like changing the input, right? And you're trying to like see kind of, or you could also treat that as parameters of the model, and then you're trying to like see how that affects the output. So I think like I think there's a few companies these days doing kind of like prompt tracking and just like prompt engineering, and I think I have a feeling that the like as models get better, I mean, who knows, but like as models get better, the need for kind of like manual prompt engineering seems to me like something that is a bit short term, because models will kind of be more robust and hopefully handle like more imprecise prompts, be able to generalize to like a greater variety of inputs. And then also there's like going to be probably more automated prompt tuning techniques because at a certain point, it just doesn't make sense for a human to go around and like try to change a bunch of words or add sentences. It just makes sense for that to be automated, right? And so I could totally see a world where that happens. I think the next part though is about like evaluation, and I think that part honestly is pretty challenging and is not quite solved yet. I think one thing that a lot of people are pretty interested in is this idea of like LLM based eval, right? Because I mean, if you think about the output, it's a generated output, and then you want to measure the quality of that, and how do you do that, right? And so like if you look at traditional machine learning, it's usually like a number, like a floating point number or an integer or something, or a probability value. And then it's just a lot easier to take a number and give you some metric off of that versus like get a piece of like like yeah like a iterative sequence of like fixed of text, right? And then try to like get a evaluation metric off of that. And so LLM eval is almost like a way of cheating where you just like, oh yeah, let's feed this text back into the LLM and then see how well it thinks it does. Like I think it's a very interesting idea, and we do have some features within LlamaIndex that allow you to do that too. I do think though that there's still some challenges with respect to like latency and cost that I think would still need to happen to make this type of eval like a bit more feasible. One thing I've noticed is just like, yeah, I mean, the more calls you do to the LLM, like the slower it gets, right? So like, how do you do evaluation over a data set of like 100,000 rows and 100,000 rows, like 100,000 sentences? It's just going to be very slow and probably pretty expensive with current models. Not to say it's not going to come down later on, but I think that's like one of the things that we need to solve. And then the other part is just like the right kind of benchmark for evaluating whether you need like ground truth or not. And I think like collecting ground truth labels for like every single piece of like questions like over your source of data can actually probably might not actually be the most feasible process.
Right.
And so like one thing that we have in LlamaIndex is the ability to kind of like evaluate the quality of your outputs in a label free manner. And I think that's that's like actually another aspect that is quite interesting, which is like, do you actually need to collect human feedback and labels for every like question or input prompt, or can you actually just have the LLM auto eval itself?
Got it.
So one thing we've just been, I mean, I don't know if we offer like a full solution yet. It's just something we've been exploring, but it's label-free evaluation. I think that term is something that's interesting, which is like, how do you evaluate the quality of the predicted response using a language model without actually having ground truth, right? And so that's just a very interesting way of like looking at the problem, because like, you know, you could send this predicted response back into the language model and then also send like the retrieve context, see if they match. There's like different strategies you can use to measure quality of outputs without actually getting the actual ground truth response.
Makes sense. Makes sense. One of the issues that, not necessarily issues, but like, you know, we get this from the community a lot, that we have LlamaIndex, we have LangChain, both of like, you know, both of them are great tools in the overall LLM space. Would love to hear about like, you know, what are some of the main differences that you think exist between LlamaIndex and LangChain? what are the use cases where you think like one of the frameworks might be better than the other? What should people think of? How should people build a mental model around it?
Yeah, I think the main difference between the two frameworks, I mean, both are open source tools, but I would just say, like, we kind of designed LlamaIndex specifically with respect to thinking about how do you like build this, management tool and query tool over your data, and
Yeah.
just to keep that very focused around that specific problem. And I think if you think about the overall goal of what we're trying to solve for is if you feed in some input prompt into our system, how do you get back like the knowledge augmented output, as well as like retrieve results that could be relevant to your query. And we think there's like honestly enough depth and trying to just like solve that, build that like really nice like query engine, like data interface that's like pretty much most of what these abstractions are about. So all the way from like being able to store and index your data, like adding some state to, defining the retrieval query and like, interaction reasoning and optimization capabilities on top of this query interface. It's all around kind of like optimizing for this use case of, getting really good results from your data using some input prompt. So we're a bit more focused in that respect. I think LangChain, it's a great framework. It has a lot of stuff in a lot of different directions. They have like prompts, they have embeddings, they have templates, they have like evaluation tools, they have agents, and they also have some retrieval capabilities. We kind of like want to fit within the overall ecosystem. So just like, if you do have like these use cases of your data, we'd love to be a module there. And then, we encourage people to kind of use a combination of these tools anyways. So we're not super opinionated on like what you use outside of this. So if you want to build, for instance, like higher level agents or kind of like chatbots that can reason with like a bunch of APIs. I mean, LangChain offers that, right? But like, if you have within that like kind of use cases over data, right? Like you want to ask a question over your data, we'd offer ways to just be a tool within this agent framework. And so I think I think there's just like different layers to like the kind of like agent abstractions that people can build. And we kind of see ourselves focused more on the data side of things.
Got it. I see. Lovely. Awesome. So basically, if I understand this right, like, the focus for LlamaIndex is around, like, how to query on your own data and, like, building a lot of depth for that specific problem.
Yep.
Whereas for LangChain, it's around a lot of breadth over with the overall LLM tooling, I assume.
Yeah, and like interactions, like APIs, especially like the agent frameworks, there's just like some general abstractions within LangChain. Like you can, build all these tools, like build this overall like kind of interactive agent and build like simulations, those types of things. I think for us, it's just like if you have, maybe one of those sub problems that you do want to solve is some sort of like interaction pattern with your data, and I think our tool is designed to be a part of that.
Makes sense. Understood. What are the top three requested features that you're hearing from the users of LlamaIndex? Like what is it that people are craving for?
That's a good question. I would say like there's probably like features in general, and then I think there's just like things that we should do. And then I think so in terms of like features, I would say one is there's just like writing LlamaIndex in like a different language. I've gotten probably like over 10 requests and like or not like 10, like a lot of requests of just like having a TypeScript version or like a non-Python version for people that aren't super familiar with Python. I would say that's something that we're definitely considering. It's just kind of a matter of like both resource allocation as well as something that we're trying to think about if it like makes sense within our service as like a data management and query tool over your data. And so it's just something that we're brainstorming, but definitely we're listening to that user feedback. The other part of this is probably some aspect of just like being able to almost like see integrations of using LlamaIndex within a lot of these like downstream chatbots or agents that people want to build. And to some extent, a lot of these capabilities are honestly already possible. So I think this is a more of a matter of like education, tutorials, and exposure, and just like play around with the tool set that we already have. I would say like just raising awareness. Like honestly, in the past few weeks, we've added like a ton of stuff to LlamaIndex. And I would say, if you don't follow our Twitter super actively, like you're probably going to miss like 90% of this. And so it's just like education of some of these things, because we actually offer very powerful capabilities over this. And then probably the next part, like that we think is going to be pretty interesting is probably some aspect of just being able to um, integrate a bit more deeply with like kind of probably like multimodal data sources. I think that part is very interesting. Just like how do you ingest not just like unstructured text, but develop like better abstractions within your documents to handle like structure within your data, like JSONs, all those things, and then also like images, like video, like audio. Like how do you just like index different types of data and still use that with a language model?
Got it. Awesome. Thank you so much. And do you plan to launch a commercial offering with the product with the project soon, or that's a little bit far out?
It's a good question. So, just we are a company. We've incorporated. My co-founder and I have been, actively trying to grow the team. I will say, I think we're definitely thinking about trying to scope out an enterprise offering, and it is coming. I think the main thing is that to say is that the open source project is not going away or being limited in any form. Like actually, like growing the open source tool is probably like is still like our top priority. I think the matter is just like what kind of problems scale in a certain setting within the enterprise setting that we can also build for. And some of these features might not make sense in like an open source tool anyways. So for instance, stuff around like data access control, kind of like production grade data connectors, being able to like scale to higher volumes of data, being able to connect to like kind of custom data sources within an enterprise setting, and even developing some UI or end user facing features. Those are all things that we're looking at.
Got it. Very nice. Just one other question, Jerry. Maybe like a couple other questions very quickly. Um, So you have been working on this for the last 6 months, right? What do you
Mhm.
think? And of course, like whenever you manage such a popular open source project, there are a lot of challenges that happen, right? But I'm very curious to understand what is the most difficult technical challenge that you have solved for when building LlamaIndex, and it could go back all the way to setting out the first line of code and the first infrastructure, or something that you came across over the next few months. What would love to hear about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the technical challenges are probably less about machine learning. Because honestly, the machine learning part, like the hard part's being done by the model providers, I guess, like the researchers actually training these models, and more about proper open source library design. And if you think about it, right, like, and if like to contextualize this a bit, like it's kind of interesting. Like when I started this project, it was one of those things where I actually didn't really start this project with the intention of like having people like use different modules within it, just because it started off again more as like a design project. But the moment you try to make this into something useful, into a library that you want to bake as part of someone's like workflow, then you've got to make, you've got to think about the right abstraction levels and how do you like provide the right balance of opinion versus flexibility for the user.
Right.
And I think honestly, it's something that we've kind of just like been doing, been like constantly trying to do and are still doing now, right, over the past few months. And I would say, we came out with this like big release like about a month ago with the 0.6.0 release. And like we basically rewrote a bunch of abstractions within LlamaIndex to kind of like make a lot of the components within LlamaIndex way more modular and extensible, right? And still provide the right level of abstraction to the user. And just like proper library design and how do you like think about the general abstractions that people need to that people want to use, and provide that in like in a library format. These are all questions that we're kind of constantly thinking about. I would say honestly, that's probably the hardest technical challenge because honestly, like implementing a research paper, like implementing experimenting with some stuff, it's not too hard, right? Because like you're just like writing some code, you're like checking out stuff in a
Right.
notebook. But making this useful for users, making this like really like a part of someone's workflow and building the right modules for that does get a bit more challenging.
It's probably 100x harder problem to solve than than implementing the research paper, to be honest. Coming up with like a general abstraction that works with a lot of people but still provides that right level of comfort for people to use, that they're deriving value out of it. So it's super hard. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. How do you one last thing, how do you keep up with all the latest and greatest things happening in this space? Like what are some of the recommended sources or materials that you would recommend our community to go check out?
Yeah, I I'd honestly be open to suggestions on this front. I think for me, it's more just honestly some combination of Twitter or Hacker News. I think that's
Okay, yeah.
probably the main source of information.
To be completely honest, like I'm hearing this from a lot of people that it's Twitter where it's all happening. Like Twitter, like you have to be on Twitter to be updated on what's happening in the space. So yeah.
Mhm. Exactly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jerry, for taking the time to like speak with us and help our community with and share your insights with them. And good luck with the amazing project that you're building and like the company that you're building around it. Very excited to see where this all goes, and excited to be a happy user of LlamaIndex as well. Thanks a lot.
Awesome.